Yo, welcome into the BeBall Jones podcast. The goal of this podcast in my business is to bridge the gap, to fuel hoop dreams into impactful realities on the court and beyond. So thank you for tuning in. Hope you enjoy it. What is going on, Dr. Myles Murphy? How you doing?
Yeah, I'm not too bad.
I'm glad to have you here, man. We have a professional here. We got a doctor here. It's big time.
Yeah, it's some days I claim it, other days I try and deny it.
Why would you deny it though?
Well, it depends what's on the news and where I'm at a dinner party or whatever. You always try and pretend you're nothing to do with medical or healthcare when you're at a dinner party, because then you always get bombarded with questions. You always claim it on a plane because you try and get the free upgrade. So it depends on the day as to whether or not you'll claim the status or not.
Okay, I understand. So on the days where you are trying to claim it, how do you tell people who you are? Like you say you're a doctor, but what do you tell them about yourself, about what you do?
Yeah, so I'm a mix of a clinician and a researcher. So depending on the day, some days I'm in clinic treating patients, and other days I'm doing a lot of research into how to better treat patients, but also how to prevent injuries. So I treat a variety of different injuries, but predominantly focus on injuries in the leg, so hips, knees, and ankles. I try and avoid backs and necks as much as possible. So yeah, predominantly hips, knees, and ankles, and with a big interest in sort of the tendon, muscle injuries, and also the joint and ligament injuries is sort of where my main focus is. And then I consult for a variety of different sports. So from everything from I work with one of our sort of national basketball teams and consult for a lot of their injuries and when they're quite complex, but I also see everything from ballet to football to athletics. So pretty much if you've got legs and they can get injured, I might end up seeing them at some stage or another. And that's sort of how I would describe my job is, depending on the day, I'm either on the ground at the coalface treating people with injuries, or I'm in the office at the university trying to figure out how we prevent them.
Okay, so with this being a basketball podcast, let's dig into some of the more basketball common injuries. So let's start at ankles first. I think that's a good place to start. So when it comes to the ankles, what's the most common thing that you see that we're getting wrong about our ankles when it comes to preventing injuries?
Yeah, basketball's a bit of an interesting one because the difference between, say, basketball to, say, football or other sports is you don't get as many of what we call time loss injuries. So there's always injuries. Some people will miss games, but on the whole, compared to football, you don't get as many injuries where people actually have to sit out from play. You have a lot more injuries that niggle players. So it's very rare if you asked everyone on a basketball team to put their hand up if they had no pain or injury in their legs. You'd never have anyone putting their hand up. They've always got niggles somewhere. And I think that's probably one of our biggest challenges in the basketball space is that having pain is almost accepted as a normal part of the training journey. And the issue with that is once you get one injury, we know that you're more likely to just get a lot more. And definitely in the ankle, one of the classics would be the ankle sprain. Oh, I've just sprained my ankle, but it's fine. Everyone in basketball sprains their ankle. Well, yeah, just because you've sprained your ankle and everyone else does it, that doesn't necessarily mean that's okay, because we know that can influence your balance, it can influence your strength, it increases your risk of other injuries. Even hamstring injuries are more likely after an ankle sprain. So I think that's probably the biggest thing that we get wrong in the basketball space is there's this culture that training through pain and constantly having sore joints or sore tendons is okay because you can still play and you can still shoot. Whereas in let's say a football setting, you can't really get away with it as much because the demands of the game are a little bit different. So people end up missing larger chunks of time in those sort of sports. Whereas in basketball, you tend to carry injuries, and a lot of the time carrying those injuries can also hamper your performance. But they also often brew and brew and brew, and eventually they lead to something much worse.
Yeah, that is a thing. Like, basically, we have this thing where we say if you either hurt or you're injured. And if you're just hurting, if it's just a little ankle sprain, okay, you can still play. If you're injured and you know you can't perform, then all right, you'll sit out. Anything less than that, you have to show up and perform. I don't know
Yeah.
exactly when. I think just because it's a level of you can still perform, you're okay. And it's just the
Mm.
guy mental toughness thing on top of that too. But how should we handle it better then? If we so we sprain our ankle and we're in the middle of a game. What should be the next step we take?
Yeah, well, if you're able to keep playing, I think the reality is people enjoy sport, and if you can get through that game, you get through that game. But I think the big thing that we want people to start understanding is that injuries do come with consequences. And that might be something like after you've sprained your ankle, most people get really stiff. So they really struggle after they've sprained their ankle to get their normal range of movement because the joint's a bit swollen. You favour the other side a little bit more. And that can often lead to, like I said before, things like hamstring strains or other injuries by carrying that bit of ankle stiffness and soreness. So I think probably the biggest thing I'd say is don't just fob your injuries off as, just sore. They are still injuries, even if you can keep playing. And having some form of management plan around them to try and minimize how much they're impacting you is really important. So for the ankle, for example, just because it's sore but not sore enough to stop you from playing doesn't mean you shouldn't do anything to take care of it, because there's still some damage there. There's still inflammation in the tissue. We still want to get it as strong as possible, if for no other reason than to stop you getting another one. So things like working on your strength and particularly balance after ankles. Once someone's done an ankle injury, their balance tends to be absolutely dreadful on that side, and that makes them even more at risk of doing another ankle or a different injury. So I think it's really just about trying to get the injuries taken a little bit more seriously. And that doesn't mean that for every injury you need to go and see an athletic trainer or a physical therapist or a doctor. It's really just saying that in yourself, if you're noticing that your ankle's stiff, if your ankle's sore, try and do good things to help get it better. Make sure you're doing your ice baths. Make sure you're doing some strengthening exercises like some calf raises to keep the strength in the tissue, or make sure you're doing some balance exercises to try and get that back to as good as it can possibly be, because it's really important.
Okay, so like you said, let's do preventative measures to make sure in the first place we're not even having an ankle injury. So now let's go there. So we want to get into basketball. What is the first step we should start taking to have healthy ankles?
Yeah, I think it depends on the age. I think in the younger cohort, so if we sort of say our basketball athletes between 12 to 18, one of the biggest things that you can be doing at those ages is some very basic strength training. So the joke that we always sort of say with our younger athletes is that all of the hormones that people get banned from sport for taking when they're older, you've pretty much got naturally circulating at unbelievable levels prior to when you're 18. You've got huge amounts of growth hormones and all these other things that are circulating that make it really easy for you to get strong and increase the amount of muscle that you've got. So we really want to capitalize on that. The flip of that is we don't want to turn everyone into Arnold Schwarzenegger, is that having a basketballer that's built like a brick isn't really conducive to being able to jump and move efficiently. So it's striking the balance between, in those youth athletes, trying to get them as much muscle strength as possible so that they can protect their joints and can get as much longevity in the sport as possible, while also making sure that we don't put on too much bulk and then sacrifice their performance, which is pretty tricky. Because some people, like I'm a string bean, so I struggle to put on any muscle, so I never have to worry about how many weights I do. I'm never going to get too big. Whereas other people, they just look at a weight and they get bigger muscles. So they're the ones that often have to be careful about how they're training. And those people that can bulk really quickly sometimes do better with a body weight program. So lots of endurance style body weight exercises. whereas the athlete cohort that struggle to put on weight often do better with gym-based strength and conditioning. So that's what I'd say in the younger group is figure out your sort of body type and try and do whatever you can to build as much strength without sacrificing your performance by potentially getting too big. In our 18 plus, if you're lucky enough to have gotten to 18 in basketball and not had an ankle injury, one of the best things that you can do is, again, the strength and conditioning. But by that age, you've usually got a fair bit of conditioning and physical function under your belt. And things like ankle taping do have a fair bit of evidence for stopping you from re-rolling your ankles. So you can look into ankle bracing or ankle taping as a quite easy measure to try and reduce your risk. But we know that they're not foolproof. So trying to also do things like stretching if you're feeling tight and other things that might reduce or help your recovery, while also trying to do as much strengthening work, whether it's in the gym or more of a body weight based program, would be very beneficial.
So what are some strengthening exercises for the ankles? Like you mentioned calf raises, but are there more things we can do to strengthen the ankles?
Yeah, so one of the best things to do is a calf raise, because the calf raise gets your main calf muscles really, your big calf bulk, what we call your gastrocnemius and your soleus, the two big muscles in the calf that are responsible for all your propulsion. And the calf raise is sort of your big whammy exercise because it gets the lot. What the calf raise isn't very good for is control, because the way a lot of people do it is just an up and down. It just does the strength. So the other thing that can be quite good to pair with your calf raise is to also be including things like what are called farmer's carries, which are our where you get like heavy weights in your hands or some form of thing like that, and you walk on your tippy toes. So you're basically walking around like a ballerina, but with big heavy weights in your hands. And the idea here is to teach your calf a lot of what we call isometric control. And that's really important because one of the crazy things when we sprint at our full speed is we all think our muscles contract and get shorter. But when we sprint at full speed, our calf muscle remains pretty isometric, and it's our tendon that does the springiness. So that the calf contracts and stays at one length, and then all the movement in the ankle is actually occurring because of the stretch in the Achilles. So it's really important for our function that we can actually maintain a static calf position under heavy loads. So things like walking around with heavy kettlebells or dumbbells can be really beneficial for improving your calf function. The other thing is that's a good balance exercise for people that, particularly if they're adolescent, so under 18 and don't have fantastic balance, that can make a big difference there. And then the final one for the calf or the complex is really your balance training. Now, people get, I think, sometimes a bit too technical with balance. They love to use wobble boards and Bosu balls and all these crazy things. The reality is, as an athlete, you don't run around on a Bosu ball. So I think we sometimes make it a little bit overcomplicated because even the elite athletes that I see struggle with just simple one-legged balance tasks. So standing on one leg and doing things like what we call the arabesque, which is more of like an RDL but on one leg. They do it a lot in that sort of ballet move. That's really hard to do. Really, really hard to do that on one leg and stay stable. It's even harder to do if you try and do that with your eyes closed. So they're really simple exercises that you don't need a lot of equipment. I mentioned before that you'd use something like kettlebells to do your heavy carry, but you could easily use a really heavy school bag. Anything that's got some weight, you could easily just walk around with that to get the same stimulus. So you don't have to have access to a gym. You don't have to go to a gym, because I know a lot of people hate gyms. So you don't have to go into that environment. So yeah, that can be quite useful. So if I had to pick my big 3 exercises for the ankle, it would be that calf raise, the walking with a heavy weight, so a tippy toe farmer's walk, and then like a one-legged balance exercise. And an easy one to do is the arabesque. A lot of people do just standing on one leg, closing their eyes. But I think if you're a basketballer, that's too easy. If you're struggling to do that, okay, it might be a good idea. But I think that isn't where you need to end. You need to be making it a little bit more challenging and a little bit more complex, because the demands of the sport are much higher than that.
What about slant boards? Have you ever experimented with those?
Yeah, so they're pretty common in a lot of different things and a lot of different sports, partly because of they can decrease the load through the ankle with different exercises. Um, they're probably on a person by person basis. Probably a lot of people use them and might not necessarily need to use them, but a lot of people who have really horrendous ankle range can actually benefit from using them quite a bit. So yeah, I definitely give them to the odd person, but on the whole, it's much more prescribed if someone's got a really stiff ankle and pretty poor balance is when I would look at doing things like that.
Yeah, so I've seen them used a lot of different ways, and I'm trying to see if I can explain it. So this is the slant. Sometimes you'll have it where they'll be going down because it helps with the range of motion in the ankle to where they can get deeper in the squat. Or I've seen it, this is the slant, and their foot be this way, so it's more challenging
for their
the weight
balance
of
and
where it would
stopping
be.
them from rolling the ankle. Yep.
Exactly. And then they'll do the inverted version of it to where it'll be the opposite way. So how would you use it in that sense where it's more of, like you said, putting the weight on it to prevent the ankle sprain?
Yeah, so the way that they're typically used is to help people with ankles. So the way you said first is where their ankles up here and their toes are down here. And that's great for helping them squat and do other things, because a lot of people even like to stand on plates when they're squatting, right, because their ankles are a bit stiff.
Yeah.
That's probably the most common way. The way that is used most for ankle injury prevention is that sideways, so where you're standing on it and the outside of your ankles at the lower end. And that's not a bad idea, because it does make you have to really challenge your balance to not roll the ankle. But you'd want to be pretty good by the time you get to that stage, because if you roll it off one of those slant boards, you're rolling from a pretty decent height. So you'd usually you can really aggravate them. So you want to be pretty good by the time you get there, but definitely you can use it. And I know some people do a lot of calf raises in that position to teach them that control. I probably don't do a lot there, because even though the exercise sounds good, we don't run on slanted surfaces. So I try and make the training a little bit more functional to a flat surface. So yeah, I don't do a lot of it, but people definitely do. And then the last one is where you do sort of your calf raises with your toes in the air and your heel down quite far. That is another way to challenge the calf raise, and it makes the calf raise a lot harder because you've got to go through a lot more depth. Probably the biggest issue with that, again, is if you're someone that's got a grumbly Achilles tendon and you try and use the slant board, it often makes it sorer, particularly if your Achilles is sore at the bone insertion, because that stretch and the compression can actually make the Achilles really grumpy and really aggravated. So a lot of people go, oh, I've got a sore Achilles, I've got to do lots of calf raises off the slant board. And that will work for, say, people that have the pain maybe in the fleshy part of the tendon. That can be a little bit helpful. But if their pain's closer to the heel, that can really flare up their tendon. The other thing that we see in basketballers, which is why I don't necessarily like the reverse calf raise, is that if you took a squad of basketballers and the majority have probably had ankle sprains, one of the things we know often occurs when you have a lot of ankle sprains is you get a little bit of increased bony growth in the front of the ankle. So you actually get a lot of stiffness in the front of the ankle. And when you do those calf raises off the board, you can actually get some impingement in the front of the ankle, which can really flare up people if they're already getting some of those symptoms. So people that get pain at the front of the ankle joint or swelling at the front of the ankle joint when they have a heavy training session or they play a game and they find that their ankle's swollen afterwards, you do some of those calf raise positions off one of those boards, and because you're constantly getting them into that position where the the bone's just compressing at the front of the ankle, it can be quite aggravating because it's sort of just pinching the soft tissues at the front. So it's a hard one because the 3 exercises that I started with are pretty safe to give to anyone, whereas I think the slant boards probably are a little bit more of a one-by-one decision as to whether or not you'll benefit, because some people will find them really useful, but particularly the last 2, the sideways stance and the inverted calf raise, you can flare people up if they've got different types of injuries. So yeah, I'd say if you've got a slant board and you're someone that gets pain in the front of your ankle, it's a big no-no to try and do the calf raise into that position. And if you're someone with Achilles pain that's really close to the bone, I'd also avoid the slant board. But if you've got healthy ankles otherwise and you've never had an ankle problem in your life, the slant boards can actually make the calf raise a lot harder, which can be good for your ankle control. But you've just got to be careful as to who does it.
Hey, hold on. Time out real quick. We're going to get back to the episode. I know you're enjoying it. I know you're enjoying the show. But I need you to help me real quick and to make sure that this episode can grow, make sure this podcast, the show can grow overall, and you can keep getting great guests like this. Make sure that you subscribe and follow along. So if you watch right now on YouTube, help me out by hitting the subscribe button. Go ahead and do it real quick. If you're listening in your car, chill out for a second. If you're on Apple or on Spotify, just like when you get a moment, hit the follow button, but not right now while you're driving. If you're working out or something, or you're chilling in your room, then go ahead and subscribe with me. Like, help me help you, okay? But thank you for watching. I really appreciate you. I'm going to stop interrupting so you get back to the episode. Thank you. Yeah, another way I've seen the slant board be used is for plyometrics. So they'll also use it to where they're flat surface, jump onto the slant board to challenge that control of the, like you said, rolling of the ankle. So, then they'll play around with the angles of it. So they'll go, sideways and come forward and go backwards. The same thing, just jumping on the slant board. Would you trust using it that way, or how else would you experiment with the plyometrics with the ankles?
Yeah, that's something that's seen probably in a basketball setting more than other settings, because what that basically does is mirror when you're coming down from, say, the basket and you land on another player's foot and you're going to roll from that height. So that's really the position on the slant board, and that's what that's trying to protect. So yes, that can actually be a very good exercise to improve the strength and the control. The problem is it can also be a really good position to hurt them. So you've got to really make sure that if you're going to give that exercise to someone, that you're pretty confident that they've got a very good ankle, or if they've had a previous ankle injury, that they're really on the road to recovery. That would be, one of our end stage exercises. And even then, I would probably only give that to someone if they had their ankle strapped, just because you don't want to be the person that rolled your key player's ankle. And at least if they've got the ankle strapped, even if they go over on it, they're less likely to do big damage. But it is a position that's pretty unique to basketball, where you come down on someone else's foot from that height and you can get that huge rollover of the ankle, as opposed to other sports where you just roll over in relatively flat shoes on a flat surface. Whereas, basketball, you come down, you've got a lot of momentum behind you because you've got that gravity body weight combination. Someone's foot's in the way and you go over. So I definitely see why that exercise is used, and it would benefit some people, but that'd have to be pretty good before you'd put that into the program.
So let's say they're not ready for the slant board. What are some other plyometrics you would use for preventative ankle sprain?
Yeah, so people struggle just with plyometrics themselves and getting their foot in good position. So I'll often have people I'll mark some dots on the floor, and I'll put a dot on the floor and I say, okay, I want you to hop on the spot with your eyes closed and see where you end up. And they usually start on the dot and they end up about 1.5 meters to the left or the right. They just go absolutely crazy. So even just jumping and landing on the spot can actually be really challenging for some people to keep that balance. So you can just use that as a really basic introduction exercise, because if they're just hopping on the spot, they're highly unlikely to re-injure their ankle or injure their ankle. So that can be a good one. I really like hopping onto boxes and stuff like that. So you can do like, double leg jump off the floor and then you land single leg on a box. So you're doing a box jump, but you're doing a single leg land off a low box. That can be a really good one for ankle stability. The same going down is you can either jump single leg down, land double leg, then do a jump into the air and land on one leg, or change that combination. But probably the best thing to do for the ankle to increase its balance is training. Basketball training in and of itself will be very good for improving general ankle stability once someone gets to the level where their ankle is feeling a lot better. But otherwise, our exercises are things like the standard standing on one leg, like the arabesque style position, whether or not you close the eyes to make it harder, jumping on the spot, jumping through different jumping drills. But I would always try and land them on a stable surface. I don't really do a lot of jumping and landing onto wobble boards and stuff like that. I've just had either patients or colleagues who've had horrible experiences of really good athletes jumping up onto the Bosu ball and they roll their ankle and then it's a disaster because you've caused an injury in the person you're trying to prevent the injury in. So I tend to always do stable surface landing because in basketball you are stable surface landing. For that sport, it's potentially different in others, but I make the jumps as complex as possible and I usually try and get them to hit a target so that they have to have that bit of movement control with the jump and the land.
So one thing that I know in the basketball community is we're going to wear ankle braces, and since basketball is pretty much year round, that means we have people wearing ankle braces year round. How do we manage the ankle brace usage and not using it? Because you don't want to use it all the time, every time you're performing, because you're not actually developing and getting the ankle stronger. So how do we balance that relationship to wearing the ankle brace versus not wearing it?
Yeah, so this is a big debate. So good question. And it's really hard because we know that ankle braces reduce the risk of ankle injuries. We also know if you do all your training in an ankle brace, you don't get as strong in the ankle. So it's trying to find the balance right between making sure that you're preventing injury risk while also doing the best that you can to increase the strength. So my thing that I usually do with patients is that I'll usually say that if you're doing exercises where there's really very low to no risk of an ankle injury, you shouldn't be wearing a brace. So if you're going down to the court and you're going to shoot around and you're not really doing any high speed, change of direction, cutting or anything like that, then you probably don't need to wear your ankle brace. You'd be very unlikely to roll your ankle. And to be fair, if you rolled your ankle just shooting around, I don't think you would have lasted that weekend's game anyway. So I would usually try and avoid it in those sort of settings. But any time that there's competitive team training, definitely ankle bracing is something that is just a good thing to have from a safety point of view, especially because you don't want to, again, be that person where the one time you don't wear it, you re-injure it. But I think it is really important that if you are wearing the ankle brace all the time, that you do take some structured time out of your day to increase your strength, improve your balance. Because if you work on your strength and you work on your balance without the brace on, even for 5 minutes after training, the massive benefit that you'll have in your strength and your ankle control will balance out the bracing. So I think for basic things like just, if you're just doing tons of free throws, ankle bracing is useless. But if you're doing training or you're playing, it makes sense to have the ankle brace on. But then afterwards, and sometimes strength and conditioning and the rehab or injury prevention after training is really good because you're actually doing it at fatigue. So you're fatigued and then you're forcing the muscle to have good balance. You're forcing the muscle to have good strength. Can be a really good way to counteract some of the negative effects of the bracing. But I don't think you can do away with bracing because we know that it is quite helpful.
And I don't remember exactly when it got popular, but the shoes that are flat-footed. So over here, the Chuck Taylor, the Converse, and the Vans, and the Vivo shoes, the barefoot shoes. they became more popular in more recent years because they're healthy for the foot. But then we saw a spike in a lot of injuries because we saw people who had weak feet and weak ankles going from 0 to 100, and they went even worse because they weren't ready for it. So,
Yep.
would you recommend people using those type of shoes more often, and if you do, how do we get prepared to where we can wear them?
Yeah, generally shoe wear is up to the athlete. I know I recommend different things to people, and it usually comes down to whether or not they think they look good. I know I reviewed a player today and they've got a very specific injury, and I said that one of the things they would probably do well in is a really, because they love wearing slides. And I said, the Hoka slides would probably be good, but, they're absolutely ugly. So, you might need to wear that around home and not let any of your teammates know that you've got a pair. But so it can be very much dependent on what the athlete's willing to wear. Because sometimes they'll just tell you that they're going to wear cons and they don't care what you say that's what they're going to wear. And if that's the case, you just work with it. There is a lot of science that's gone into basketball shoes, and particularly around the ankle sprain prevention. So there is some merit to wearing proper basketball shoes. The flip side is that, again, it's like bracing. The more supportive the shoe, the less your muscles actually try and do themselves. So again, it's about finding the balance. Whether it's a basketball or whether it's a runner, as soon as you try and reduce the level of support in the foot and the ankle by way of shoe wear, you do need to balance that with the strength, because you're taking away what the shoe is doing, and all of a sudden the foot is having to do that. Now, that might be better for your strength and your injury prevention in the long term, but in the short term, it can make you more likely to get more injuries. So what I see a lot of is where people go from shoes that have a big heel, which encourage them heel striking a little bit more, and they go to those flatter shoes where they run more on the middle of the foot. And all of a sudden, you've got an athlete who's never had a problem in their Achilles getting a sore Achilles, because their calf is having to do a lot more work because they're not cushioning as much with the shoe. That's probably the biggest. Or they start to get shin splints because they're impacting and hitting a bit harder. Everyone's a little bit different. So I think if you're going to wean out of one form of shoe wear that you've worn for a long period of time, you want to do it slowly. You don't just go, okay, I've got a brand new pair of shoes. I'm going to completely go from my super supportive shoes to my completely unsupportive shoes. You need to do that slowly over time. And I'm talking sort of 6 to 8 week transition. Might be that, right, you put the new shoes for one training a week for 2 weeks, 2 training a week for 2 weeks, 3 training a week for a few weeks. Then you start, once you're comfortable in them, you can start playing in them. The hard thing is athletes like to train and play in the exact same footwear because, all you athletes are super superstitious, and you get paranoid if there's any weird changes and stuff between what happens at training and what happens in a game. So it is tricky to do, but yeah, the more you can focus on the transition, the better. So what I would typically say is that the trainings earlier on in the week, so they're less close to the game, wear your new shoes, and then wear your old shoes towards the end of the weekend for the game, because then the shoes that you've trained in the session before the game are then the ones you're going to play in the game. So you sort of feel like you're wearing the same shoes, and then you can slowly start to transition that into the different footwear. And in that same time, you want to be doing exercises that are going to encourage strengthening the ankle and strengthening the calf. So those 3 exercises that I said before, the calf raise, the heavy walks on the tippy toes, and then doing some one-legged balance control work would serve really well as exercises to help you transition through that. We often throw numbers around as to how many things you should do and how many calf raises is enough and all of this sort of thing. And the number that's pretty consistent, even within the research, is 25 good quality calf raises. So if you can start to do 25 good quality calf raises, you're going okay. Now, when I say good quality calf raises, that's really slow and controlled, because a lot of what people do is they just bounce the foot, and they're using their heel as a bit of a trampoline, and they'll go, oh yeah, I'm doing 50 calf raises, and they only go up halfway. With a calf raise, you want to go all the way from the floor, as high as you can possibly go, and all the way down. And you sort of want to take 1 second to get up and 1 second to get down. And you're minimizing the amount of time that you're on the floor. So it's sort of 1, 2, 1, 2. And you want to be able to do 25 of those. And if you can do 25 of those, you're doing pretty good, because we've done a lot of research, and it should be published soon actually, but we've done a lot of research where we've looked at sort of the normal values for athletes. And it's weird that 25 was always what people thought it was. And then when we assessed the data, it pretty much came out that 25 calf raises is the number that seems to be quite good and protective for the foot and the ankle. So it's something you want to strive towards.
Mm-hmm. So would you recommend someone doing those strengthening exercises every day, or how frequently would we do that? Let's say, go back to preventative measures. Like, would you do that every day, every other day? How often would we do that?
Yeah, so it's dependent on the person. So every athlete that I have, I go, the best rehab program for you is the one that you're actually going to do. So sometimes there needs to be a little bit of compromise. And for some people that are really busy, to do 3 exercises, and it sounds stupid, it might take 5 to 10 minutes, but they just don't have 5 to 10 minutes at one time. And particularly if people have young kids, or they've got school commitments, or they've got, everything else going on in their life. So I would usually say for strengthening, if you do it 3 times a week, you're doing pretty good. And if someone wanted to if someone's training most days, so you're training 5 to 6 days, and that's not unusual for basketball because most people will go and shoot on any day that they're not training, is that you finish a shooting session or you finish a training and you just pick one of those 3 exercises and you do one after every training. Knowing most of the athletes, they avoid the calf raises because they're the hardest. So that's the thing they'll try and avoid like the plague. But yeah, you can do, say, calf raises after one training. The next day you might do, even if you didn't have weights, you might do the tippy toe walking up and down the stairs in the stadium where you're training. That would be harder than just doing it on the floor. Still gives you the same stimulus. The next day you might do the balance exercise. So it's only taking you a few minutes after every training or shooting session, but you can get them done. And that's typically going to get you doing the exercises 2 to 3 times a week, which is pretty good. Other people will go, no, I'm happy to do them in one block, and they might do all 3 after training 2 or 3 times a week. And that's also fine. So I would generally say whichever way you can do it, I'm happy for you if you do it, but ideally 3 times a week for each of the exercises would be perfect for increasing the strength and increasing the coordination through the ankle.
I think that's good. So is there anything else that we missed on the ankles? Anything else
No,
that
I
you've
think
been noticing in the
that's the
research?
ankle pretty covered.
Mm. All right, so let's go to the hips, because I had an interview with Dr. Ebony Rio, and we pretty much went crazy with the knees. So we might circle back there at the end if we have time, but let's go to the hips. So what's the most common injury that you notice with the hips that most players have?
Yeah, interestingly, we probably don't see a lot of hip injuries in basketball players. If they do, it's usually of the hip flexor or the labrum of the hip, which is sort of the cartilage and the lining of the hip joint. But they're pretty unusual. So I don't think we see a lot of hip injuries in basketball players. But what we tend to see is the hip being pretty dysfunctional. So what we see a lot is that the hip might not have the injury, but it's often the cause of other injuries. So I'm sure Ebony mentioned, but with the knee, one of the things that we know can increase the load on the knee is if the hip isn't doing its job properly. So we see a lot of issues in the knee or even in the ankle that are coming because the hip's not functioning properly. So the hip's probably not so much of a area where we get a lot of injury and pain in basketball. It definitely happens, but not as much as knees and ankles. But it is definitely somewhere where there's a lot of muscle weakness, which causes problems. And, if you compare, the average build of a basketballer, quite tall, relatively lean, and you compare that to other sports that have really powerful glutes, like if you looked at, say, a sprinter, or you looked at, say, a tennis player, they've got completely different glute sizes. And the basketballers tend to be more on the scrawny end of the spectrum through the hips, and that's because of the sport. They're just not developed as much, and they're not as important to their specific movements. But when you're jumping and landing, if you're landing from a jump and you're knock-kneeing and stuff like that, we know that that's your hips not functioning properly. That's not your knees failing. That's that your hips aren't holding your knees where they should do. And as a result of the hips being really weak, the knees are coming and hitting together in the middle, which is not something that we would want. So definitely the hips, we try and encourage a lot of strengthening. And the two specific movements that we look for are getting stronger in the hip extension, so the back part of the glute muscle, and the hip abduction, which is the outwards movement of the hip, which is the outside muscle of the glute on the hip. So the back and the side part of the glute on the hip are the most important. And the reason they're the most important is they're the ones that tend to be the least developed in our basketball athletes.
So we're strengthening those two. What are your go-to exercises for hip abduction and hip extension?
Yeah, so hip abduction, probably the best exercise that you can do is a side plank. But the trick with the side plank is you can't have the feet together. So you actually need to do a side plank. You need to be in perfect alignment, and you need to have your top leg lifted into the air. It is a complete game changer. People will go, "Oh, Myles, I can do side planks for days. That's not hard at all." You tell them then to lift the top leg, and their bum just drops straight down to the ground. And it is a bit unfair in basketballers because if you've got really long legs, that's a much longer lever that you've got to try and lift up into the air. But definitely that is one exercise that we do a lot of, is our side plank in that group. And the goal is to have the bum as high as possible. So I usually try and encourage that in the side plank position, you're side planking on your forearm, so on your elbow and your forearm, and then your trunk is horizontal. So you've got to lift your bum high enough that you could almost balance a glass of water on your side. And that is really hard to do if you do that with straight legs. And then you're trying to build up to 1 minute holds in that position. It's pretty brutal, but it is really effective at increasing the strength. And then all of a sudden, people's knees start to get less aggravated because we do a lot of work in the knee on the motor control and trying to fix the movement and stop people from getting knock-kneed. But if you haven't got the muscle strength in the hips, you're not going to have much success at changing the way the knees are moving because you're still dropping in from the hips. So, yeah, we do a lot of abduction-based side plank strengthening in pretty much actually any of our athletic cohorts, because that is a muscle group that's really neglected because it isn't directly related to performance. So your hip abductor doesn't help you jump higher. It doesn't help you run faster, but it's very important for optimizing your mechanics so that you don't get injured when you do things like jumping and landing. So that's the abduction. For our hip extension, a lot of people will start with the standard single leg bridge. So lying on the back, lift one leg in the air, and then you lift your bum up and down. For an athlete, that's super easy. Most athletes can do that for days. They're not too fussed. So I prefer to do the hip thrust in my athlete group. So they have to have their body resting on like a gym bench or on a couch or a bed or something like that, their upper trunk, and then their feet are on the floor, and then they have to do a hip thrust. And the big key with the hip thrust here is they have to thrust the hip higher than the horizontal. So when most people do their hip thrusts, so if you see people in the gym doing heavy barbell hip thrusts, they go from a really deep position to almost neutral, but they don't go all the way to neutral because then the bar would start to roll up towards the belly button. So they're missing out on that most important part of the range, which is where we go from sort of a hip flexion position to a hip extension position. So with the single leg hip raise, I'll always say, okay, do it with 2 legs. This is how high you can get. Now try and do that with 1 leg. And they can't do it. They just don't have the strength on the 1 leg to get that same height. And they go, oh, I'm really stiff. I go, well, no, you're not, because you just did it. So you can't be tight. That's stopping you getting there because you just did. I really want you to start pushing up. So I'll tell them when they do their 1-legged hip thrust they don't have to get the bum as low. I don't care if their bum doesn't go low to the floor, but they have to get the bum as high as possible, and they have to push through the horizontal so that they sort of go from this position, if this is their hip, and then they go just slightly above, down and up, down and up. And that's with one leg. And they struggle with that. But it's one where they start doing it, and then all of a sudden they notice this huge difference. And interestingly, that single leg hip thrust or hip thrust exercise has now had a lot of research behind it, and it's very much related to your maximal sprint speed. So it's one of the exercises that if you can do and you can build that muscle up, you can actually accelerate in a straight direction much faster, which you say that to most athletes and then they forget about the injury prevention. They go, oh, you can make me run a bit faster. I'm going to do that just for that reason. I don't even care about preventing injuries because on the whole, athletes are more impressed with things that make them play better than what helps stop them get an injury. But, you got to take the small wins, whatever gets them to do the exercise. So, the hip thrust is what I would do to build up the hip. And particularly in the youth athletes, they really struggle with that. They'll wobble all over the place. They'll be really shaky. They won't be able to get their hips up because they've grown so much. They've gotten so tall so quickly. Their muscles still trying to catch up, and they, in particular, don't have that hip strength. So getting that hip flexor range can be that hip extension range, can be really, really important for that group as well.
And you said you'll start with one leg first, and then go to two, or two legs to one leg.
I'll start with two legs just so I can show them how high they've got to get. Because if I start with one leg, they always just tell me, oh, well, I can't get any higher. That's as high as my hips go. So I always cut that argument out by making them do one leg first and do two legs first, almost as a bit of a warm up and go, okay, well, this is how high I want you to get. Now you've got to try and do 20 repetitions of that with the single leg. And I'll try and get them to do 3 sets of 20 repetitions on each leg. This is usually, of all the exercises I give anyone, this is the one that they come back and go, Myles, I hate that exercise. They go, it's probably the best exercise I've ever done, but I hate it. It's just this, our body hates strengthening the back of our glutes. Absolutely hates it. So even though it's probably one of the best things we can do from a prevention point of view, the athletes hate it. They thank you for it, but they hate it. So it is a really good one to do.
Yeah, that's funny. But when it comes to the hips, one thing I've noticed, me personally too, and other people, is that there's this talk of having tight hips versus they're too loose. So initially, like, just because we sit down so much, we'll have issues on our hips. We'll think, oh, they're so tight, I need to stretch them. Then you hear the other side of it where they're tight and they feel weird because they're too weak. So how do we figure out if they're too weak, we need to strengthen them, or they're tight and we need to stretch them?
Yeah, it's a really good point. For most people, I very rarely come across an athlete that has really strong posterior glutes. And that's one of the things I really like about the exercise that I just spoke about, is if you're pushing your hip extension, single leg hip thrust all the way to the top, you're actually stretching out your hip. So during your strengthening exercise, you're also mobilizing the front of the hip and getting that bit of extra range because you're going in the complete reverse position of sitting. And that's why I think our bodies hate that exercise so much, is that we're so accustomed to sitting and that lazy posturing of sitting that you try and train the complete opposite direction of that, and the body almost freaks out and says, no, this isn't the way I want to be. So I'll usually say to people that a lot of the tightness that they get through, particularly the front of the hip, will often go away if they actually strengthen the glute, because all of a sudden that glute's actually giving you much more hip stability. It's controlling the femur, the bone of the upper leg inside that socket, a lot better. So I find with most of my patients, they don't actually need to do a lot of hip stretching. They need to do hip strengthening, particularly in a basketball context. They definitely can get tight. But the other thing is, when you think about the range of motion that you need to play basketball, no one's hips are so tight that they can't actually move to play. So it feels tight, but they haven't actually got a true range of motion restriction. It's just that the muscle's got that feeling of tension and tightness. So yeah, you can get that massage, you can trigger ball that, you can use a massage gun, you can go crazy with stretching. But I would say 90% of the time, if you really strengthen up that posterior and lateral glute, most people's sensations of hip tightness will actually go away just with doing those two exercises, because all of a sudden their hips are a lot more stable because they've got so much better muscle around it that their brain isn't sending their hip signals to go into spasm and tighten up to protect the joint, which is what happens is a lot of the time you're getting tight because your body's going, well, hang on, my hip's overloaded, there's too much load going through the hip, you've got to protect me. And the way the body protects it is to make all the muscles spasm up and tighten. You get some good strength and some good control around there, and all of a sudden the brain doesn't have to send those warning signals down to the hip, and you find that your tightness goes away even though you haven't actually had to do a lot of active stretching. You've done all of the strengthening, and that's what's settled it down.
So would you recommend any type of hip strengthening exercises?
So from a strengthening, I think that the big two of the two that I spoke about, the hip thrust and the side plank, from a stretching point of view, definitely some stretching is important. From a basketball specific point of view, you tend to be tight through the hip flexors. It's 99% of the time that's where the area of tightness is through the front of the hip. So that sort of hip flexor lunge stretch where you're in a kneeling position and you're throwing the hip forward can often be a really good stretch. The issue that I come across in some of the athletes, like basketball in particular, is that because they get kneecap pain or patella tendon pain, they hate kneeling. So that often isn't the best position for them to stretch out the hip flexor, because even though that's the one, if you Google what's a good hip flexor stretch, that always pops up. It's too sore for you, so you don't tend to get a good stretch through the hip flexor in that position. So one of the ones you can do instead is you can lie on your tummy, keep your pelvis locked onto the floor, and then do a cobra extension. So you push your whole body up into extension. That can help stretch out the front of the abs, the hip flexors and the quads, all those really tight areas, which can be quite beneficial. And the other one that can be good is if you lie on your tummy and you just do a lying on your tummy, bend your knee and try and lift your foot to the ceiling. And you lift that as high as you can and you try and hold that. It's good because it gets the glute working, which is a nice one, but it'll really start to stretch out the front of the hip. Because if you're lying completely flat and all you're doing is lifting your heel in the air, you will actually get a nice stretch through the hip. Now, the big cheat that people will do is that their lower leg, like their tibia, should be straight up to the air. As soon as they start to lift, they'll be doing all sorts of wonky things if they're really tight. So sometimes it's good to be in front of a mirror and you can see, well, if you lift the hip and your knees start to go out and you start to do this, well, hang on, you're not stretching the hip flexor anymore. You've deviated out of the position. You've got to keep that really upright and try and do that lift. Most people can't lift it very far. Most people are lifting 1 or 2 centimeters before they try and rotate the hips to cheat and make it look like they're getting more stretch than they really are. So that can be a good one as well to stretch out the front of the hips, because if you're guarding, you're doing anything in that sort of forward flexed, hunched over position, plus you're sitting a lot, you do tend to get really tight through the front of the hips. So those sort of exercises can really help elongate the front of the hip. Particularly, I did say before that strengthening tends to fix those problems, and I do think that it does. But to get stronger, it does take a number of weeks. So if you're sitting on the bus and you're about to get off, you've been on the bus for 2 hours to get to where you're playing your game, you can't just do one session of strengthening and all of a sudden your hip feels better. So stretching is still really important, and those sort of positions tend to be really good that I just spoke about. But the long-term solution is more in the realm of strengthening. So you can use your stretching foam roller for your short-term relief, which is really important. But when we look long-term into the future, it's really getting the hip extensors, the glutes, and the hip abductors, that outside glute bulk, to be really strong.
All right. Okay. Another time out. Okay. Look, if you got to this point, you have to be enjoying the episode. Like, you have to. At this point in the episode, you're enjoying it. So help me help you. Just if you're on Apple right now and you're on your phone, okay, just take your phone, press the subscribe button. It's right there. Just do that with me. Even if on your laptop, take your mouse, boom, click over, boom, do your thing. Now you subscribe. Now you linked in because you don't want to miss the next great episode that I have. But doing stuff like this helps the episode grow, makes the show grow, and the podcast grow, so I can keep getting great guests and keep doing great interviews. So if you listen on Apple or Spotify, take a second, look at your phone, press the follow button, okay, and share with a friend or two because you'll find the value in this. You want to have this conversation with your friends so they can have the same value. Now the whole basketball community can grow. All right. Thanks for listening so far. I'm gonna get out your way. Let's get back to the episode. Appreciate you.
Yeah, I think the groin and adductors are probably the only place we really see injuries in basketball, any type of like any tweaking or anything. How much should we focus on that when it comes to our training?
Yeah, the adductor is always an interesting one. And the reason that the adductor injuries occur is because of the rapid change of direction. The other in times that you'll see it is if you get the floor's a bit damp and your foot might skid out and then you get that overstretch injury through the groin. They make a really small proportion of the overall injury load. So if you look at any of the basketball data, the adductors just don't tend to be a huge issue compared to the ankle. The ankle and the knee are terrible, but the adductors are the biggest one in the hip. They're still pretty rare. I think if you got the glute and the hip extension, the hip abduction stuff sorted, I feel your ability to change direction is so much better that you're going to risk the adductor less. So I don't think you necessarily need to focus as much on it. But there's a really good exercise called the Copenhagen adduction, which is very good for preventing groin injuries, which is where you can either get a teammate to hold your leg and you can go for that. The problem in a basketball context is that because legs tend to be really long, you can get a lot of force through the knee, and the knee can sort of drop in and get a little bit aggravated sometimes with the Copenhagen adduction I found in the athlete groups that I've worked in. So sometimes what is better is if you hold the leg at the knee instead of holding it at the foot. So if you Google what a Copenhagen adduction is, you'll see that they hold the ankle. But if instead you were able to hold the knee and then you did the exact same exercise, but someone's holding the knee or you're resting the knee on the bench, I think that's a far better exercise for the basketball context. If you got better, you could always progress to someone holding the foot, but I'd definitely be starting it at the knee. Otherwise, I'd be really worried that someone's going to start developing a bit of knee pain from the injury prevention exercise, which is never a good idea.
So for the Copenhagen, do we do that timed or do we do it rep? Is it more static and isometric when we're holding it there, or do we kind of rep it out and move it?
So the Copenhagen adduction is a bit of a weird exercise because the top leg is static and the bottom leg is moving. So if you imagine that you're doing a reverse of a side plank, so you're doing the side plank, but your foot is on a chair or someone's holding your foot in the air, they lift you up in the air and then you keep that leg still and then you do leg lifts with the bottom leg. So you've got one leg moving, which is the leg that's actually doing less work. It's the top leg that doesn't look like it's doing anything that is the one that is getting the workout. The rep ranges vary. I would usually try and tell people to build to about 45 seconds of that. I tend to use 45 seconds as opposed to repetitions because I've seen people do this and they can pump out 20 reps in about 4 seconds. So if you use reps, they can all of a sudden go, oh yeah, I've done all my injury prevention. It only took me 30 seconds. Whereas if you time it, it doesn't really matter how fast the bottom leg goes. You get a really good workout through the top leg. So that is a good one to do, particularly if you've had a history of groin injury. But compared to, if you had to prioritize something, I'd definitely be saying prioritizing some of the ankle exercises I spoke about, or, prioritizing some of the knee-related exercises that Ebony would have spoken about is going to be, where you get the biggest bang for your buck for preventing your basketball injuries. If you've got lots of time, definitely throw in the adduction stuff, but the hip extension, abduction, the knee exercises, and the ankle exercises will well and truly prevent most of your injuries that are going to niggle you and prevent you from being able to play. The reality is you're always going to get a lot of finger injuries when you miss a pass and stuff like that, and there's very little that you can do to avoid that other than just get better at catching. And that will leave that for the coaches. But in the legs in particular, that's where we can be really effective with getting some strength and some better control to prevent these injuries that, niggle and then prevent performance or cause a lot of time loss that impact people's careers and, the enjoyment of playing sport.
Mm-hmm. I think that's it for the hips. Do you have anything else that you want to throw in there for there?
No, I think that's good. I've talked plenty.
All right. So I wanted to touch on one thing with the knees.
Yes.
That I don't think I touched with Ebony is the knee straps and the knee sleeves and everything. How much does that actually help our knees versus kind of a placebo thing?
Yeah, pretty minimal. If you've got a true patella tendinopathy, sometimes the patella tendon strappings can be helpful for symptoms. The knee sleeves are an interesting one. One of the reasons that sometimes the knee sleeves feel good is they actually prevent how much you can flex the knee. So they actually keep your knee a bit straighter. Because we know with most of the knee conditions, particularly the kneecap pain, patellofemoral pain, the more you bend the knee, the sore it gets. So sometimes the knee sleeves, even though biomechanically they don't do anything to realign the kneecap or anything like that, they just stop you from bending the knee as much because it feels a bit tight through the front of the knee sleeve as you try to bend the knee more. So sometimes I find I don't think there's any evidence for that. That's just what I think when I see athletes and I see them move, is that I think sometimes the knee sleeves, by limiting how much bending you can get, do help some people with knee pain, and the knee straps can help people with knee pain. But it's a helpful tool that you can try. If it helps, great, use it. If it doesn't help, don't use it. But it's not going to be the thing that fixes your knee pain. You need to do the strengthening and stuff like that. But the braces can help with symptoms. But it depends on the season. So if we were in season and I had an athlete who had a sore knee and they found that a knee sleeve or a knee band was helpful, I would 100% be getting them to use it. When we get to the off season and they're starting their rehab, that thing better not make an appearance. Is that we're fixing this knee and I don't want them using that to help relieve pain and symptoms. I want them to be doing all their exercises and all of their training pain-free. So when they're in season, there's a case for it. But even if it was early in season, I'd even be a little bit cautious. But if it's towards the end of season or even mid-season and it's helping them with their pain and it's helping them get through games, absolutely go for it. But you would want to then try and get rid of that as soon as you can.
Yeah, I had them when I was younger, the knee straps. And the issue with me that I had with them is that, one, I had to tie them up very tight for them to, one, stay on, but two, kind of actually reduce the impact that I feel on my knee. But then two, because it's too tight, I had to loosen them up. So when I loosen them up, they'll fall off and wouldn't stay on all the time. And then they don't help because then I actually, giving the pressure off of my knee. So I always wondered after that, I was like, does it even work? Is it even worth the hassle of it? So
it's so dependent on the person. So dependent on the person. And the reality is, if you're a player and you only get 5 minutes in a game, you might be able to do it if they're really tight because they don't have the time to fall off. Whereas if you're playing a lot more minutes, you're getting really sweaty. The reality is that they do cut off blood flow and you do need to loosen them off at some stage. And then if they're too loose, they're not doing anything and then they just get in the way and stuff like that. So you're spot on that they can be useful, but they also have some drawbacks as well, which is why, if they're helping an athlete, we'll let them use it. But we don't try and use those as a standard in any of the athlete groups that I look at, whether it's volleyball, whether it's basketball, whether it's netball, any of those sort of jumping, landing sports. We don't try and use them as, something that everyone needs to have. If someone's trying them and they're working, or we're trying to get someone through a season and they work, great, but they're not a main staple of the rehab and the management.
I've seen a lot of more people using the tape for their knees. So have you seen that more often? You know what I'm talking about?
Yeah, I would always prefer to tape than to use the straps, because the tape's a little bit smaller, so you can actually tape and compress a little bit with the tape without interfering with the blood flow as much, because you can do a really broad strap behind the knee, and then you can sort of twirl it and really push into the kneecap at the patella tendon at the front. So I think most people tolerate strapping better than the braces, because it doesn't cut off the blood flow as much, so they can get through games a little bit better. But the same principles apply. If it helps, great. If it doesn't help, don't bother. And it doesn't have a place in preseason.
Has there anything that you've seen that has helped the knees, like more generally across the board?
Not really, which is frustrating, because I've seen a lot of trends come and go, and every time there's a new trend, we think it's the new big thing, and then it just never really pans out. The thing that has always been consistent and will always help is getting stronger. So getting the strength and conditioning and really good exercises through the legs always makes a huge difference. Unfortunately, any of the quick fixes, I always get hopeful that the next one around the corner is going to be the thing that really helps athletes a lot. But unfortunately, a lot of the quick fixes just don't live up to what they say they will do, which is a shame, because they're all designed to help people keep playing sport. But yeah, I just don't find that any of those things tends to be super useful, because at the end of the day, when I think of getting an athlete as healthy and as prepped as possible, it's making sure that they get at least 8 hours of sleep, making sure that they've got fantastic nutrition, and making sure that they have a really good strength and conditioning program, inclusive of their rehab. And if you tick those boxes, I think that makes up 95+% of getting a healthy athlete. If you can get sleep, nutrition, and your strength and conditioning right, 95% of what you can do that's controllable by the athlete is ticked. The rest of the 5% are things like your knee sleeves and your ice baths and that sort of stuff. But the 95% is the strength and conditioning, sleep, and nutrition.
All right, this is probably my last question. So,
no worries.
When it comes to the knee strengthening exercises, is it going the same line what you said with the ankles? As much as you can, if you can, or 3 times a week is ideal. Or is there anything we can do daily to get rid of the jumper's knee, patella tendonitis?
Yeah, so the strength and conditioning for the knee is a little bit tricky, because as opposed to the ankle, there's not as many good exercises that are body weight for the knee. So, most people, if they're coming in with really grumbly patella tendon pain, or they're coming in with patellofemoral pain, so kneecap pain, the leg press and the leg extension machines can be really useful. There's a little caveat to that, is if you're using the leg extension machines, so the seated leg straighten or quad extension, you typically don't want to straighten the knee out all the way. So people with pain through the front of the knee usually get quite provoked if you give them a knee extension all the way to straight. So I always try and give them that in a more bent knee position. So they do it from the depth and straighten it to about 45 to 60 degrees, depending on how it's feeling. But for the leg press, I do the opposite, is they start in a completely straight position on the leg press, and I don't let them bend more than about 60 degrees. So the leg extension and leg press exercises are fantastic for the knee pain. Now, not everyone has access to that. So if you don't have access to that, one of the exercises that I do quite like to build up some of the strength in the front of the knee is the one-legged plank. So the same plank that tortures everyone and tortures your core, but you do it with one leg. As soon as you get rid of that second leg, all of a sudden your abs stop feeling the pain and your legs start feeling the burn. So that can be a really nice one to start strengthening up the quad. And the other one that can really help with the quad is like a partial range squat. So things like a sit to stand, because one of the things, whereas if you do even if it's a one-legged sit to standing exercise, because you're going into a sit back position, so your bum's going back, your knee doesn't really bend that far forward. So your knee's not going very far over the toe, which decreases the load through the knee, which makes the exercise a bit easier to do. So you can get a lot more repetitions out. So things like, one-legged sitting to standing exercises. And if that's sore, you start really shallow. So sometimes I've got people starting on a chair and they might have 2 pillows on the chair and they do it up and down off that because they can't go any lower. And then as they get stronger, they take a pillow out. As they get stronger, they take the other pillow out. That can be really good. And that's also a good one for your knee control because you can see that pretty clearly yourself or in the mirror. And if your knee's almost ending up on the opposite side of the chair, you've probably got pretty bad technique, right? So just making sure that there's some form of control there, but also very good for strengthening the quads and the glutes. And you combine that with something like a one-legged plank, and it's a really nice combination to start getting your knees a bit more healthy. A lot of people like wall squats as well, as a nice isometric exercise that you can do. And wall squats can be good because you can go into very minimal amount of bend against the wall. So you can, even bend the knees about 45 degrees. And most people go, well, that's not very hard. And I'd agree, it's not. But if you then lift your toes into the air and just keep your heels on the ground by having very minimal amount of knee bending, but lifting the front of your foot, all of a sudden you've got extremely sore quads because they are working really damn hard. So it can make the exercise so much harder by lifting the front of the foot. And it's an easy one that you can do if you don't have any access to equipment that can help strengthen up the quads.
So you recommend lifting the toes up rather than lifting the heels up?
Yeah. So if you actually try it and you go against the wall, even if it's only at 45 degrees, and one of the reasons that I like that 45-degree position is that that's actually the position that most people will jump from if they're going for a high jump. Like we do a lot of exercises in really deep squatting, but the reality is if you're playing most sports, you actually never go as low as we squat. But we like people to squat in those ranges, and then they just get knee pain because they squat so deep. So the wall squat in a shallow range is relatively functional because the knee's at an angle that it actually performs. And if you pull the feet up so only the heels on the floor, it all of a sudden becomes very hard for the quads, and you'll find that easy hold becomes extremely hard very quickly. And then I usually, again, tell people to try and work up to 1 minute holds in that toe lift position. But they've got to lift the whole foot, so it's just the heel on the ground, and that'll make it pretty tough. And you put the feet. So the way I always think the best position is if you did go down to 90 degrees, your knees should be at like a 90-degree angle, and then you just raise from that. So you've got to put the feet a little bit further forward than most people think they need to, which again decreases the load through the knees because you're limiting the amount of bending with the strengthening exercises.
Yeah, I've seen a trainer talk about how if you want to challenge it more, you lift the heels up so you're sitting on your toes more. And he said that puts a little more tension on the quads instead. So that's interesting.
Yeah, it does in the deeper position. So if you're doing a 90-degree wall sit and you lift the heels, it will definitely use a lot more calf and a lot more quad. I find when you're in the shallower ranges, like the 45-degree bend, if you go up on the toes, because you're a bit more angled, it doesn't really actually feel that much harder. But if you lift the front of the foot in the shallow positions, that's when you really start to feel the burn. Whereas, I just don't think it's as hard in the shallow ranges, but it does flip a little bit when you get deeper.
Okay. Well, that's it. I don't think I have any more questions for you. I ran out.
No worries.
Well, I do appreciate you coming on. This was a good one. It's a lot of good game, a lot of good information out here. So we should all be very healthy by the end of listening to this, as long as we apply it.
Hopefully.
So, hopefully that's the main piece. But thank you again for coming on. If people want to contact you, is that allowed? Do you want people to know you? Do you want to be famous?
Yep. So, oh God, I don't know about famous. But if people want to contact me, if you just Google me, I work at Edith Cowan University, and my contact details are on the university webpage. So my email, which is just m.murphy@ecu.edu.au, is on the webpage. So if they want to Google that, and I'm happy to send that link through to you. People are more than happy to have people contact me via email. I'm usually pretty good on email, so more than happy to be contacted.
And if we wanted to research some of your studies and papers and everything, how could we do that?
So I can send some of the papers through, but I do have a ResearchGate account as well, which will have all of my papers on there, and I've got all my papers on ResearchGate. If you request them, I can send them through. So that might be the easiest ways. If you find me, Myles Murphy on ResearchGate, and any of the papers that you think are interesting, if you request them, I can send through the 4 copies of those easily enough. And we also did Ebony and I recently worked with a couple of other people, and we created a couple of infographics which were specifically designed for patients to help manage Achilles pain. So they're in the Journal of Orthopedic and Sports Physical Therapy. I'll send you the link for that. They're free for people to get, but they're specifically designed for patients that if you've got a bit of a sore tendon, what are the 5 things that you can do to try and make it feel better yourself before you need to go and see someone about it? And then the other one is if you do go and see someone about it, what are the sort of the things you should be looking for in the consult? What do you want them to be telling you, and what should you be asking? And then things to be cautious of if they start to suggest different things on how to treat your tendons. So I can send through the link to that as well, because I think that would be really helpful for people. Given how sore Achilles can get in jumping sports, having those little tools on how to sort of self-manage that can be really useful.
Oh, that'll be very helpful and useful. So we'll have that available for you guys. And if you want to contact the man, let him know. First off, you got to tell him how great he was in the episode. That's first and foremost. Let him know that he gave a lot of information, a lot of great game. Thank him. And, just tell him overall he's a pretty great guy. Why not? So you can reach him over there and contact him that way. If you want to stay in touch with me, get in touch with me at BeBall Jones. That's BeBall Jones on all social media. But make sure you subscribe if you're on YouTube. Make sure you're following if you're on Apple or Spotify. And that's it, guys. So thank you for watching. Thank you for listening. See you next episode.